Well, good day, Dr. R. Michael Vischer. Another on the series of Spirituality 101, as I call it. I started this series just as a brief here because I felt so much of the spirituality of today is drifting into becoming religion, number one, or religiosity to a degree that becomes ideology. To me, that's not cool for spirituality to go that direction. And there's a lot of reasons it's going that direction. And there's a lot of critique I have and some other people have. But that's one of the reasons. I think a lot of people are getting misled, and not only by others, but are being misled by their own understanding of spirituality. So that's one of the reasons I started Spirituality 101. So if you're here for discernment and thinking and not just trying to take something from another speaker about spirituality that's going to help you in life, in other words, when I said take and not just really opening up your cup to be listening and receiving and understanding and doing more study, then you probably wouldn't want to be on this channel watching me, because I'm not somebody who just gives, the package of what people want because they're hungry spiritually. In fact, I think that's where we get into our big addiction problems within the spiritual world, of people adopting spirituality. And again, as I said, often it ends up becoming, because of that sort of addiction to need to get, to give me, my spirituality, that identity structure itself is a type of spiritual materialism, as Shigmund Trungpa would say. And I agree. It starts to serve more the ego, if not the superego, and not serve the larger reality of spirit, the divine, if you will. So again, it's a informative educational program here, and I'm not here to, make it all nice ice cream and cheese and crackers and wine. So let me take a drink on that. It's early in the morning. I just got up and I knew I needed to do this because I just got a new book, Post-Truth World, Ken Wilber. And it's new, but it's not totally new. It was written in 2017, 3 months. It was actually penned, as I was reading in the intro here. It was penned three months after the inauguration of Donald Trump for president of the United States, 2016. Yeah, so I thought very appropriate. We're now in the post Donald Trump 2.0 era, and Ken Wilber has a lot to say. Ken Wilber is one of the spiritual teachers I have followed. He's a philosopher, and actually, on one of the pages here in the intro, he calls himself, I'm a professional scholar. And I've heard him call himself a lot of things. I've heard people call him a lot of things, but he is a professional scholar, and I would go slash. He's definitely a psychological theorist, philosopher theorist in the field of transpersonal psychology, is where he started, and then East-West psychology as part of that, and then definitely became a moral philosopher. Never took up the practice as a psychologist per se. So great theorist, great philosopher, and a big picture thinker. So when he talks about what has happened in this book, about how we got to this post-truth era, post-truth, what does that mean? Well, initially it means we've gotten into an era where there's a large enough percentage of the population, not all, it's significant. One doesn't know exactly the percent that has shifted into a world. Now he's going to call that postmodern world. Okay, so that's important. In other words, it's the world that comes after modernity, after modernism. And so most of us would think that's the ordinary world we're used to. There's also traditional world before modernism. and then you can go back to ancient world. So I'm just giving you a few kind of categories to put some hooks and labels on a historical evolutionary perspective here. That's Ken Wilber's work, big perspective. I love that kind of big picture. Now, you can't solve all the world's problems with big picture, but without a big picture and a big map of understanding and for analysis and where we want to then find solutions today, that's what he's focusing on. I'm going to read from him today in this book. It's like that big picture is important. So just hold that in mind. Postmodern, that can mean a lot of things to different people. It's a very controversial term. But I think he's really talking about post-structuralist. And he says that in different books, but in his more popular books like this one, he'll just use postmodern for a more average reader. He's not trying to reach the scholar intellects totally here. So this book is about just after Trump getting in 1.0, people freaking out, a lot of people very happy, of course, um, that he won and is going to change, right? He is sometimes called the transformative president, which is, to me, as someone who studied transformation theory and philosophy for a long time, I'm appalled that anyone would label him a transformationalist. But if you're talking about making big change, if not revolutionary change, Trump has done it and is doing it. And whether I like it or not, or whether it fits my understanding of a good, healthy transformational theory, right, and practice, leadership, that's another story. That's up to me, and most people in the world in reality don't care about that kind of detailed, fine discernment of what's healthy and what's not healthy. They're just glad a vast majority, to have the vast, big transformational quotes change that's happened since he got in 2016 and then definitely in the 2024. So I'm following all of that as a Canadian, as a philosopher thinker, a lot like Ken Wilber. I do see myself as a professional scholar, attempting to understand big pictures so that we can come to better analysis and to better intervention. So I will have, and Ken Wilber will have, some on this program today, interventions that you can make. And I guess the first one is sit back, breathe in the chaos, and if not the kind of terrorization and the horror, the unbelievable, seeming, and shocking that is going on. This age of unreason, as I'm going to read his 2024 preface he just wrote for this new book, which is an old book, but this is the new version. And he is really advising us that is going to be really important to be, in a way, centered, right? Some people call it balanced. Some people are going to call it in harmony and unity. I don't use those terms per se, but the idea is there that it's really important that we can be able to bring our self back to a self-regulation through all our various techniques that you choose or I choose. But it's also study, to actually study the phenomenon going on without seeing it all as bad. Similar to COVID-19, I spent a lot of time just studying the phenomenon and doing practices within that COVID-19 experience of the pandemic shutdown, while a lot of people are flying around reacting in terror, and understandably so. But if you want a bigger picture of what's going on, which I do, because I'm interested in the path of fearlessness or path of liberation, as is Ken Wilber. That's why I've followed his work since 1982. A real interesting and powerful liberational theory called integral theory he offers for us, which leads to an integral life practice. Part of that is to sit back, study, do the interior work to not be totally reactive. We do need to resist oppressions and horrors, do what you can there, but ultimately keep the big picture. Okay, so that's what spirituality 101 for me is. So what is big picture? Um, I've been very critical of human potential, New Age, wellness, mindfulness theories and practices, and how they've been popularized and commercialized. And a lot of people are making a lot of money and getting lots of fans under those labels. I have chosen a much more at the edge of the edge in the margins of the margins approach, because virtually I find anything that gets too popular is going to be probably quite contorted and distorted in this particular kind of culture society we live in now, which is one of commodification and everybody consumers, right? They want to grab. So that's my intro. A bit long there before I get into reading Ken Wilber, because he'll guide us into this problem. He's going to analyze this post-truth era that many people are very concerned about. And you can see the simple answer is, if you don't listen to this whole video, at this point anyway, is that we've moved into an era where it seems a lot of movement, a lot of grab in interest is that we don't need universal truth anymore. In fact, to even say anything is the truth would be ridiculous. So we've moved into relativism. We've moved into where universal values, as well as universal truths, universal sense of what reality is itself, that these have become, in a certain part of the culture, a significant part, very useful to a Donald Trump who can take, and his people will take anything and twist it into their own truth. And anything that their opponents say is the truth, he will say that's a lie. And that if you do that consistently enough in a kind of madness making, as you can kind of hear, it's a kind of insanity building, but it's very useful for a dictator, authoritarian leadership. He's not the first to do this. But what Ken Wilber says is we can't focus too much on that. We have to see through the world. And that means see through. This is spirituality in its best. It sees through that drama, all the things that most people pay attention to and get caught on, and what the spiritual, precise, open minded individual can do with a critical lens, but with the open heart as well, is that you know that all of what's getting messed up and looks so horrible is spirit. Why is spirit doing all this? And what can we learn from that? This is the idea of spirituality when it says, and a lot of spiritual traditions teach this, everything is a lesson. In the indigenous teachings I've heard at times, everything is a medicine. So your sickness, your disease, COVID-19, pandemic, shutdown, the horrors of what's happening in the United States right now with, immigrant peoples, for example, the wars, those war zones that get so much attention and heat and emotionality and reaction, and people just driving obsessively and in fetishes toward those issues. Spirituality in the practice that I'm teaching here in this integral way, this holistic integral way, is not about getting caught on fetishes. There are important issues, and work on them if you will. Do what you can. Thank goodness you're out there doing what you're doing. We need to, again, resist certain things. But at the same time, do not lose the big picture. This is what Ken Wilber teaches so well, and other really good, what I call big thinkers. So that's what I also attempt to do and bring, is to not get caught in fear-based reactivity to everything, get caught in the dramas of this fear, this terror, that terror, trying to be bravado and brave and courageous and stand up to those horrors, and then getting so caught in that wrestling match, that conflict, that you can't actually see what the deeper conflict is at the root, at the deepest root. I think that will lead us nicely here into the Ken Wilber reading. Reading from his preface, then. Sit back, have your tea or whatever, and enjoy. Preface to the 2024 edition. We are definitely living in tough times. One of the best chroniclers of these times is Douglas Murray, a well-known author and participant in television commentary shows. The titles of his major books say it all: The Strange Death of Europe, The Madness of Crowds, The War on the West. The last book, in some editions, has the subtitle, quote, How to Prevail in the Age of Unreason, end quote, which is true enough. Today's world is, in a sense, indeed an age of unreason, but it is harder to explain how this modern world just arose and came out of the immediately previous stage of development, which was universally called the Age of Reason, i.e. modernism, which I mentioned earlier in my intro. Age of Reason. How did we manage, he asks, to go so quickly and thoroughly from reason to unreason? Something, whatever it was, must have hit our culture like several tons of bricks falling at once. Of course, he's speaking as an American within America, but a lot applicable to anywhere you live, especially in the Western world, but not only. Indeed, it did. First of all, these tons of bricks were actually several items, with one of them leading the pack. One of them leading the pack. Here's where the super attentive, well-educated critic goes, and Wilber does this very well. One of them was leading the pack of this cascade of what hit our culture. These several items included the gradual but rather widespread loss of any serious belief in our country's Judeo-Christian tradition. He's not a Christian. So he's noting religion was no longer, the traditional religion was working in America. The most clicked box in surveys in American polls asking which religion do you believe in, and they do ask that in polls, is none of the above. That's the choice most people click in America at this point. Recent survey. He doesn't say exact date of when that was, but be recent. None of the above. People are not that interested in religion anymore. There's a lot that are in certain ways, for sure, but not the vast majority. Another huge influence on our civic attitudes and where we're going in this post-truth era is caused by the internet and so-called social media. Among other things, people will simply say rather nasty things either about or directly to a person when they are anonymous, as if they were actually wearing a mask. And all social media is anonymous or mask wearing. You can easily disappear, in other words. You are a player actor without consequence, for the most part. This process, he says, of that social media digital really turns our interactions into crude, vile, often mean-spirited, even vicious, and definitely irrational. National studies have shown that teens who use significant amount of social media now have more anxiety, more depression, more suicide, and participate in more bullying. This mental health epidemic is being called by American Surgeon General a national health care crisis. Plus, there's the added national zeitgeist in general, which also seems to have set itself and taken sharply an irrational downturn into gloomness and depression. So Ken Wilber is pessimistically realistic, but he's not a pessimist or a cynicist as a philosopher. All of those now have a fully recognized hand in this downturn and have been spotted by many professionals and experts. But one super significant factor has played a major hand in this affair, likely the biggest and the most important hand. And yet, it has not been recognized at all. The major role that developmental stages of human growth themselves have on these issues. developmental stages of human growth. This, of course, takes a bit of explaining, and in this book he will do so. For now, I'll simply say that perhaps the greatest discovery in modern psychology of the last 100 years is the realization that all human beings, as they grow from birth and childhood through adolescence into young adulthood, middle adulthood, and old age, go through a series of exactly the same major stages of growth. These stages have been given various names by dozens and dozens of different researchers. A commonly used set of names is that given by the genius John Gebser, who called them the archaic stage, the magic stage, the mythic stage, the rational stage, the pluralistic stage, and the systemic or the integral stage. Most individuals proceed through those developmental stages at particular time periods in their own lives, although the earlier stages are experienced by almost everybody at the same time. The archaic stage, the first years of life, the magic stage, the years 2 to 5, the mythic stage, years 6 to 11, and then for most people, the rational stage emerges at some point in adolescence. Whether all of them develop further beyond that rational stage into the pluralistic or the integral stages varies among them, but the important role that these stages play in our recent irrational downturn into this age of unreason is that today is exactly the point when most Westerners are moving from the rational stage to the pluralistic stage. That is the same as saying moving from the modernist stage, as well as one's individual sort of modernist, rational stage, to this pluralistic stage. So I think he says, several decades ago, there was only, 3, 4, 5% of people that would be, when you're put into testing and when you're analyzed and analyze yourself, that you would be still a rationalist stage as your center core. It's not everything you are and what you believe. It's just a rational, you could call it world space. And I like how he uses that. Some people call that worldview, a rationalist worldview or world space. It's your orienting. Most people on the planet are not at even rational in this developmental sequence. That doesn't mean good or bad, by the way. Very clear to integral theory. It doesn't make that judgment. That's where most people totally misinterpret integral theory immediately. They think it's hierarchical. They think it's oppressive. These are only white males coming up with these theories. If you're in that, you would have probably already turned this channel off. And that tells me again how rigid, ideological, even spiritually oriented people have become because they're so anti-structure. They're so anti a structuralist philosophy. Remember how I said post-structuralists earlier on is one of the major reasons that we've gotten into an extreme of post-structuralism, throwing out all the structuralist theories, the models of these developmental universals, and going only for the particularist, only the pluriverse, not the universe. They want diversity, particularity on everything to such an extreme. It's become ideology, folks. It's very rigid and has a pathological edge when it gets that rigid. There's nothing wrong with the pluralistic stage. It's a great worldview. Wilber says so. All the worldviews, the archaic, the magical, the mythic, the rational, the pluralistic, and beyond, 2 more worldviews or world spaces beyond pluralistic even. So this is where we have to be really discerning and study and think carefully. And yes, criticize all of this. That's not the problem. Criticize me, criticize on this too. Give your comments. We ought to be able to discuss this in dialogue. I am not in Norris Wilbur, in that rigidity, in our best anyway, that we poo-poo the critics of integral theory. We have to take them seriously because they represent an important world space. But what world space? And the rationalists, you know, and going into the pluralistic have chosen to throw out the baby with the bathwater, is what he's really saying. Now, I'm not going to read any more of that intro. Let me pick up on another place where he now goes into what's happened. The Age of Reason was born, so he'd done a little bit of quick history in this intro. Because reason easily differentiates the subject and object, most of the new sciences of the Age of Reason strove. So, Age of Reason starting 300-400 years ago, the Enlightenment, Western Enlightenment is the argument, where you had the majority of important thinkers, not the majority of all people, no, in a society or civilization, no, but the majority of people. And the Age of Reason was also in the indigenous cultures. So this is not against indigenous cultures. They also had their people who were functioning at that level of a modernist Age of Reason and had all the capabilities and skills and gifts of the Age of Reason. Because reason easily differentiates subject and object, most of the new sciences of the Age of Reason strove to be objective in nature, more so objective. There's value to being somewhat objective. It's not discussing and throwing out and being disgusted by the subjective. No, 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 no. It's not that extreme. But there was, in the Age of Reason, this importance. We need to stand back. We need to step back out of always ourself, interpreting everything so much from the self or from our society, cultures, beliefs, perceptions, even from our falsities that are within all societies, our mythic, magical beliefs, etc., that can distort certain objective realities. Anyway, and likewise, human beings were understood to have a real subjective component as well, and thus came to be known as human persons. And most importantly, all persons have free rights. So once you recognize, see, in the Age of Reason, then people have, all persons have free rights. See, you're not just a member of the society. You are now a unique individual. That's really important, and that hasn't arisen always in all of human evolution, where you actually then have to make laws to protect people's rights individually. Yeah, this is a huge evolutionary move in what law is and criminology and the identification of court systems and fair play in the law, under the law. And most importantly, all persons have free rights. And that this Age of Reason was also the age that started to evolve, where there was a freeing, there was an emancipating of slavery, even not perfect, didn't get rid of every bit of slavery, but there was a lot of slavery even before the Age of Reason, so no one could sort of check it up. It just took off, especially starting in the 1800s, he says. Freeing the slaves was a movement. Yes, and still is one that has to be fought. Yes, through civil rights and so on, right? That continued in this Age of Reason. Technology itself became rational, and thus was adopted by people the world over. Yeah, technology is very valuable. It's part of modernism. It's part of the modern rational age of thinking. Part of this rational consciousness to be able to use tools and technology and science, create that objectivity in the reality of what you're studying and knowing and manipulating in technologies. Not all bad, but yeah, a lot of nightmares have come from that because of pathologies. That's a whole more complex discussion I won't be able to go into here. Why do every one of those ages have also pathological sides and a really good side? So that's integral theory in a nutshell. That's how when Ken Wilber crafts his understanding of history and the evolution. And I agree with it. I think it's fundamentally very wise to think that way. And he's got lots of evidence for his case. He always builds a case from evidence. Interpretation, of course, yes. The Age of Reason and its technologies went largely worldwide and was happily adopted. In other words, not always happily. Sometimes it was forced on people by dominators. That's a horrible part of the Age of Reason and technology, science. But a lot of people found it really beneficial to have machines that could pull up water out of the ground for your wells and store it in technological advanced systems and clean the water from the sewers. Uh, yeah, I'm not an anti-modernist, and if you're an anti-modernist, you're going to already want to turn this channel off. So what we're trying to do is get modernism to go to the next evolved stage. And that's huge. It's happening on the planet, whether we like it or not. That's what evolution does through these stages. That's why they're marked out, because there's a consistency, there's a telos, there's a direction. And you could even say that spirit, how it grows up, is through stages. Spirit is itself already whole and complete. Yes, no problem there, theologically. But what I like the developmental perspective of Ken Wilber of integral theory, and there's other integral theorists beyond Ken Wilber. I think he's just the most contemporary and really great thinker to be able to put a lot of things together for us. Spirit needs to grow up. It needs to learn. It's an imminent, progressive, and faulty way and essence, right? It's like spirit isn't just pure. That's where a lot of people love that romantic idea. And then they read the society completely different than a developmentalist. We'll get into that. For this reason, rationality was thought to give purely universal truths, which is indeed a partial truth. So see, he's critical in the Age of Reason, even at its best, because he's not just a Age of Reason. He's beyond the rationalist stage of his own consciousness development. He's moved into the pluralistic and he's moved beyond it, as have I. But we see the importance of articulating this post-truth era through this understanding, right, of these stages of development. That's the point I'm making. But lurking here, and this is one of my favorite paragraphs, all this Age of Reason, modern science, blah, 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 right? It's taking over. Yes, it is. It's globalized. But lurking in the midst of universal rational development was something of a time bomb, something that would kill its believed to be universal nature. It was going to kill the universals, the grand stories. And that was simply the next major stage of human growth and development. See, it's not wrong what was killing that part of modernism. It's just the next stage. And history's gone through all these stages, shifting through, right? Archaic, magical, mythic, rational. It took a long time to get to rational Age of Reason, historically, that consciousness structure, that world space. And then this pluralistic now. So let's hear that, because that's his analysis on the next few pages I'll read. Is exactly why we got into, more or less exactly, but it's a major factor, which most people, as he says, do not pay attention to, and I agree, they don't. Got us into this extreme mess of post-truth, which Donald Trump is exemplifying as a leader of a lot of power. You can control the whole federal government now. And you can just watch what has happened when you move into a post-truth world and the actual impact it has on the society, environment, ecologies, our mental health. Amazing, amazing disasters. Will there be some good that comes out of it all? Yeah, we got to learn from it. It's got to be our medicine. We got to work with it. So it's not about being anti post structuralist, postmodern, anti-pluralistic, right? I'm just using different terms again. For postmodern is the term that he ends up settling on, although he said it basically involves the pluralistic viewpoint, it involves equalitarianism, the relativistic, and the multicultural, emphasis. And this has led to a big part of culture wars, where the postmodernists are fighting with the modernists and the traditionalists of the pre-modern thinking traditions. And it's a mess in battles. So this is a conflict theory perspective of philosophy, of evolution, of development. I've always argued Ken Wilber is a conflict theorist. He doesn't come across like a typical Marxist conflict theorist. I'm a conflict theorist as well at heart, but conflict theorist doesn't mean there isn't harmony, beauty, and all the wonderful things that the New Age or people who don't want to be conflict theorists, they want to just be functionalist order harmony theorists about life and reality. They don't like conflict. So that's not real. That's not realistic. Sorry, people. It isn't. Um, the world contains these arguing orders of being. And so the new, very new since the 1960s, is this postmodern arising on a fairly major impact. Probably around 20% of the population, he argues, are at or interested and working in this postmodern. Sometimes it's called the woke culture at its worst. That's the postmodern. That's the pluralistic. That's the multicultural relativistic. That's the political identity politics. Those are all symptoms of a rising, and they have a good side, postmodern way of being, thinking, acting, valuing world space. And it's really rocking, right? You can see it. It's really rocking the modernists, and it's really rocking the pre-modernists, which is the bulk of the population, by the way. So very soon after the introduction of pluralistic stage in the 1960s, what would become known as post-truth culture. Quote, there are no universal truths anymore. That's one of the statements he says. Would become the motto of what was soon to be called postmodernism. Post-objective, post-universal, post-qualitative, post-truth culture. These all became trends, popularized. They became new contexts for understanding reality and methodologies of knowing and valuing and trying to run a society under that premise. There are no universal truths. There are no structures, right? Post-structuralism as a philosophy. From that point on, you had to say, quote, well, from this perspective, particular perspective, it seems true that, end quote. Advocates of this postmodern approach even went so far as to claim that mathematical truths were no longer universally true. Welcome to the age of unreason. Excuse me. And this is deeply ironic because the whole point of developmental stages is they literally include the previous stage. We value as a developmental theorist, thinker. You don't have to be an academic to be a developmental thinker. You don't have to be a scholar. The whole point of developmental stages, at least thinking in and giving them their worth as we analyze what's going on in reality, what's going on in human history and development, evolution, is to include the previous stage and the best of it, because it's changing, because it's adapting to new conditions. So there's a coevolution, all right, of changing of the consciousness, if you will, the worldview, with the conditions of what's going on in the environment and everything. There has to be adaptability in evolution, and there is. Stages are part of that adaptability, universal stages. And they transcend and include, is his famous phrase. In other words, this new stage is emerging, the pluralistic. It's including a lot. Yes, of course it is. We're not throwing out all reason. Most of the world is still very in the age of reason. And our technologies and so on, that what I'm using here, this comes from the age of reason. So it includes, but it also transcends and goes beyond and adds new gifted features. So that's where the good part of the new changes take place. He goes on then to try and give his theory, which he gives in all his books. If you read any Ken Wilber or watch his YouTube videos, he will talk about developmental theory in much more details. What the idea of holons are, what the idea of wholeness is, not just heaps of piles of things we call whole. He's very critical of that. He redefines integration in a very complex, what he calls true integration, in a developmental language and context of this theory. And then he says, but the worst part of pluralism, this newest, latest bulk of a stage, remember there's still two or three stages up above even pluralistic. But what pluralistic did is it thought it was the top of the most advanced type of thinking. So that's where it got caught in its own superiority. And that came because it threw out all universal truths for the first time in human history. Once you throw out all truths, all past tradition, everything, all universals, then you think you're going to be making and constructing and contextualizing and building your own relativistically, but you're also ultimately the top dog. Well, because most people still have an ego that goes with the pluralistic stage of development that still centers their perspective as the right one, their world space as the right one, the best, the most holistic, the most integrated, the most multicultural, the most sensitive to the minorities, and the most in defending victims. Pluralistic really loves to get into that, saving victims, the minority voices, the altern. Again, a good side to that, and a pathology side when it goes too far to extremes and you think everybody else should think like you. Well, that's when Ken Wilber says they just are performing a contradiction. And this is the big contradiction that pluralistic people, especially in the extreme, do not want to see. The extreme postmodernists, the extreme post-structuralists. They do not want to see their own contradiction. Then they basically are saying, but this is the best way to think for everybody. Anything else is pathological. Everything else is going to be violent. So they get into a very superiority complex, and it's hard for them because they also at the same time are claiming everybody's equal. So it's a very confusing, and it causes what he calls aperspectival madness. You can look that up. Aperspectival madness. It's when you throw out all the structures of perspectives and then try to think that you've got the universal perspective that's best anyway. You see, you can't put those two together. It's a huge double binding, and it causes a lot of insanity underneath. And so he basically argues that's what led to the post-truth era. And we're struggling with it now, how to live in it with it. I think this is long enough for that. Let me just see if there's anything else I want to say at the end. So the problem is this politics of polarization, and he's offering a vision for it, including transcending integral perspective, which comes next after pluralism. See? And that's the worldview I operate from. It's the worldview that he wrote this book from. He does all this analysis from. But even beyond the integral stage, there are two more stages. Depending on the theorist. In other words, consciousness has been shown, spirit has been shown to want to reach and expand and really in a compassionate, wonderful way. This was a whole story of compassion and wisdom. That's the story of the big picture of Ken Wilber, philosopher, thinker, and others. There, as I said, there are many other integral theorists that think, but you can get from this video, if you watch it over again and think through and just really take time with it, really not just trying to grasp what is this good for me? How can I use it? It's like getting a map. You have to spend time with it. You have to go out and truth it. And you have to have, partners, guides also to go through with you and look at the map and look at the territory. How does the map fit the real territory of the real? It has to be truth. All maps have to be truth. This map has to be truth, the integral map. But most exciting is there are so many methodologies and ways of working with this complex integral perspective that then we can have multiple ways of operating and not lose and throw out the baby with the bathwater and throw out all structure and all universals and grand narratives. That's going to lead to a continual madness on many levels. It's going to lead to more and more culture wars, this polarization. He wrote this book to help us through this horrible polarization that's going on. Well, that polarization went on in the Middle Ages when the Renaissance hit. And all of a sudden, scientists are starting to say the Earth is, we are not the center of the universe. You know, that was, these battles, people kill each other over these world space views. They're in high competition at their worst. If you can develop an integral perspective and a kind of equanimity with difference, other opposites, work in and with those oppositions, then you move to a higher existential, into transpersonal, into this integral perspective. The best of pluralism, which I've been talking about postmodernism today, Ken Wilber, it could do, and is starting to try to do that, to try to absorb and hold respect for all diversity. So it's already leading that, but it's not the leading edge that we need today. Its leading edge is failing, is what Ken Wilber argues, and I agree. And that's just all the ages, all these world spaces in this evolutionary spectrum, they all fail. They fail not because they're bad. They fail. Yes, they have pathologies with them. The pathologies come because there's woundedness, there's trauma, there's hurt, and people operate from less than the best of that worldview. They tend to regress and utilize distorted aspects of previous worldviews to sort of shore up the current worldview because they're not quite able to integrate everything in a healthy way. And the society that they're living in, the environmental conditions, nobody's fault sometimes. They've had disaster after disaster, and people can't heal enough and can't integrate enough, can't metabolize the damages. And that's right down to the individual experiencing, for example, sexual abuse as a child. See, everything is important. We're not losing the perspective and the detail and particularity in this model. What we're doing is just trying to get bigger picture, bigger, wider, expanding, deeper worldview on everything in its unfolding. And that, yes, you can see, well, I'm putting a lot of order on a lot of chaos. Yes, integral theory does that. But all theories do that. All theories. Unless you have a theory that's about no theory. And some people have that today. Some people are so extreme pluralists, so extreme post-structuralists. That's the way they think. They think any theory is going to be oppressive. Well, why? Because it's a generalization of data. See, they can't stand anything that generalizes data particularities. They're so obsessed and fetishized around particularities and identities with those particularities. You cannot build a society on that basis. It's a useful way to look at particularities. Science does the same thing. It pulls up really tiny particularities, studies them to a fine detail, the neurons of the functioning of an antenna of an ant. but you got to be able to put big pictures from that together, right? Like you got to be able to build from those particularities. You can't just sit in pluriverse particularityism. It becomes an ideology. It will stop the growth of human evolution and this bigger consciousness. So that's an argument. I'm not going to try and go on and make that argument. So read some integral theory, read Ken Wilber if you want. Watch this video again, look at my other videos, and I'll just end with, and this whole of evolution moving forward is going to continually be a movement toward less and less fear-based ideologies that run the world, that run my life. And that's a good thing because there's less suffering. And that's where it's all heading. It's spirituality 101. Thanks for listening today.